As with any client application, before you can work with any objects in an instance of SQL Server, you have to connect to it. So the Data Tools knows which local or remote instance you want, authentication information it needs to connect, and potentially other information, such as the name of the default database for the connection. Like Management Studio, you can define as many connections as you want in Object Explorer, and Visual Studio will remember them for you. You may have noticed that over time, Management Studio sometimes forgets saved connection information, usually a stored password for a connection. In my experience so far, this has not been a problem with the Data Tools, one way that it's better and easier to use than Management Studio. What I'm going to do now is connect to a local instance of SQL Server 2012, where I have the Northwind and AdventureWorks collection of databases installed. What's nice about using Data Tools for connected work is that you don't have to have an open project in Visual Studio. Alright, so here's the Visual Studio interface. Notice that if I go over here to Solution Explorer, I don't have an open project. And here's the SQL Server Object Explorer window. Sometimes that doesn't like to go away. Okay. Now, if Object Explorer isn't open, you can come over here to the View menu and select it right there, and that'll open it up within the development environment. But generally, as soon as you do a clean install of Data Tools, the Object Explorer will be part of the workspace. And by the way, if that option in the View menu doesn't appear, it means that you don't have the SQL Server Data Tools installed, or there was a problem with installation. Okay, so notice that I have SQL Server. This is the node that I'm going to use in order to connect to instances of SQL Server. This Projects node is used when you create a project, a database project, within Visual Studio. But right now we're talking about connected development, so we're going to use this node. As you can see, I only have a single instance of SQL Server that Object Explorer is connected to. And this is using a special version of SQL Express called LocalDB, and that's installed automatically for me. But I want to connect to a full version of SQL Server that's running on this local machine. So I'll right-click on SQL Server and select Add SQL Server, which opens up this Connect to Server dialog box. Now, I have various options. I can connect to any server that I want. In this case, I'm just going to use local, but I can use the machine name, I can use a remote machine name, I can use a named instance on a local or remote machine, all the same kind of options that you have within Management Studio. In fact, this dialog box should look fairly familiar because it's actually the dialog box that's used in Management Studio as well. And then I can select authentication options, either Windows or SQL Server authentication. In this case, I'm an administrator on this local machine, and so I'm going to connect with my Windows credentials. But if I wanted to use a SQL Server login, I could select that and put in the username and password. So those are the basic options. There are additional options here within the Options button. So here's where I can connect to a specific database. If I want to use this connection and always connect to a specific database, that can be very helpful during development when I'm constantly making a connection and going in and accessing the different objects within a database. I can also select network protocol and packet size. You don't often need to do anything with that, connection timeout, and so forth. And then there's some additional connection parameters that you can add here. All right, that's everything that I need to set for this connection. So I'll go ahead and click on the Connect button. And as you can see, I very quickly get a connection that is now saved within Visual Studio that I can use and reuse in order to access that instance of SQL Server. So if I expand this, I can drill down into the different objects. And there you can see I have the AdventureWorks databases, a few other user databases, Northwind, and so forth. And I can drill down into the different databases and see the tables within the Northwind database, and so forth. As you can see, it sometimes takes a few seconds for Object Explorer to go out and get the information about that node's objects. The nice thing here is that it doesn't try to retrieve references to all of the objects within a database, or all the databases and other objects within this instance of SQL Server. It goes out and gets the information as I need it, as I expand nodes within the Object Explorer. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start up Management Studio, and connect to that same instance. I'm going to connect to the local instance with Windows Authentication. Notice that dialog box looks hauntingly familiar. Okay, and there you can see all of the nodes in Object Explorer within Management Studio. So I'm going to put these side by side so that we can compare the objects that are available in the two windows. All right, so let me minimize this a little bit. Just make it easier to see them side by side here. Okay. So I can expand the databases. And if you compare the list of databases, they're all the same. And you can see most of the same database objects in each of the Object Explorers as well. So I'll drill down into Northwind here and close that. You can see tables, views, synonyms, and so forth, and expand it over here. And notice that this has database diagrams that I don't have access to here. Tables, views, synonyms, programmability, service broker, storage, and security. So most of the same objects, and you'll find some additional differences if you drill down into all of these and compare all the objects that are available. All right, collapse that. All right, and then we have a security node. So we can create a lot of the same kind of objects here. And there's some differences there. Actually, there's some additional features here within security that are supported within data tools. And then there's this server objects node. And expand that, and you can see that there are some differences there. We don't need to manage backup devices here within data tools, so we don't have that. But we do have endpoints and link servers and triggers and so forth. Well, there's link servers there too. Okay. All right, but notice that there's a number of objects that aren't available within data tools. These are mostly dealing with administrative or support administrative actions, so they're really not needed within data tools. But my message here is that Management Studio has more options, but data tools has the options that you're likely to use most often at both the server and database levels during application and database development. And then Management Studio has more options for administering and maintaining the instance of SQL Server. Okay, so this connection to that instance of SQL Server is now going to persist in Visual Studio for future use. You can create multiple connections to the same SQL Server instance, maybe to set different default databases or connect using different authentication credentials. So for example, I could connect both as local, as I did here, and as the machine name. And I can log in with different credentials. And if you want to remove the connection from Object Explorer, you can right-click on it, right there, and select Disconnect. But I'm not going to do that now because I'm going to continue to use that connection. Keep in mind that as you work with the database objects available through a connection in Object Explorer, you're working directly on the actual objects in the SQL Server instance. Any changes you make will be immediately permanent, and there's very rarely any kind of support for undo. One of the most common uses for SQL Server Object Explorer is to create new database objects, particularly in the early stages of application development or when upgrading an application's database. Now you'll see how you can create a new database and a table within it as part of developing a very simplistic kennel application for keeping track of the dogs in a kennel. The first thing I'm going to do is create a new kennel database using the connection that I already have here within SQL Server Object Explorer. So I'll just go down to the Databases node, right-click on it, and select Add New Database. Notice that I don't get any kind of a designer, dialog box, or anything. I just create the object directly here within Object Explorer. So I'll change the name to Kennel and hit enter, and we now have a new Kennel database. All right, so I can expand the node here, drill down into it, and you can see that I have all of the usual nodes that give me access to the various database objects. But it's an empty database at this point. There's a number of system tables and various other system-supported features, but no user-defined features yet. And in particular, there's a whole lot of system-stored procedures. And these, just like that you see in Management Studio, is what SQL Server uses in order to give databases all of its features. And just to emphasize the point, I can come back over here to Management Studio, refresh the list of databases, and you can see that we now in fact do have a new Kennel database here within this instance of SQL Server. I directly made a change to this instance. So this is further proof that you're working with live objects and data tools. And what you create, modify, or delete, most importantly delete, in one tool is created, modified, or deleted in the other one. Okay, so now I'm going to create a new table using the Table Designer, support within data tools for creating a table. Creating new database objects are just about as easy using Object Explorer, although the amount of information you need to provide for various objects can vary a great deal. To create a table, of course, you'll need to not only supply a name, but also a table schema. And there are two basic ways to create a new table using Object Explorer: a Table Designer and using a query and writing the T-SQL code yourself, the create table code. So I'm going to start out by using the Table Designer. And what I'm going to do is create a dogs table to hold some basic information about dogs in the kennel. I'm going to keep the table schema very simple, but there's way more information that you could store about dogs, particularly if they're working dogs, like sled dogs. Okay, so over here in Kennel, I'll come here to Tables and right-click. Notice that the only option I have is Add a New Table, or of course refreshing the list. So I'll click on that, Adding a New Table. And that opens up the Table Designer. And this has three sections. It has a grid here where you can define the different columns within the table. There's a T-SQL script pane here, and that's going to be automatically kept in sync with what you create here, or if you make changes down here, they'll be reflected in the grid up here. And then there's a context pane that I'll talk more about later. But this is useful for creating table objects, such as indexes and constraints. All right, the first thing I want to do is change the name of the new table. I'm going to call it Dogs. Now, you can leave in the square brackets. I don't need the square brackets because dogs by itself is a valid SQL identifier, or you can leave in the square brackets, your choice. Okay, now it's time to define the columns within the table. The Table Designer, as you can see, already has an ID field here. I want to change that to Dog ID, just a more descriptive name. But I'll leave it set to an int. I'm not going to allow nulls, and it's the primary key for the table. So I can hit enter, go down to the next field. Now I'm going to add three more fields: name, birth date, and notes. The birth date and notes columns are going to allow null values, since we don't always know a dog's birth date, and there may not yet be any notes for a dog. Okay, so start with name. I'll make that an nvarchar 20. And I'm not going to allow nulls. All of our dogs have names. No default value. And next I'll add the birth date. And I'll make that just a simple SQL Server date time. I'll allow nulls for that. Let me hide Object Explorer so we can see a little bit more of that screen. Okay. And then I'll add notes and make this an nvarchar max. And also allow nulls. So, as I mentioned, as I add columns in the grid, the designer automatically keeps the T-SQL pane in sync with the column grid. Okay, now with normal Visual Studio designers and code files and so forth, I would be repeatedly saving my changes, but I'm not here. This is not often advice that I'll give you because you generally want to save early and save often as you're working with computer files. But ultimately, we want to directly change the kennel database by adding this new table. If I do save the work at this point, using any of the ways that Visual Studio supports for saving code files, such as Control-S or the save icon on the toolbar or the menu item and so forth, you'll save a T-SQL script file to disk. That's fine for saving intermediate work, but it does nothing to the connected database. You would have to manually execute that script in order to create the table. But I want to hook into Data Tools' automated features here. Okay, so with the table definition as I have it so far, the dog ID column is a primary key, and you can see that with that little key icon right there. And so SQL Server will automatically create a clustered index on that column. But it should also be an identity value. So I want to change that. So first thing I need to do is select that column and then go to the Visual Studio Properties window here. And then I can drop down here to the identity specification. The isIdentity is set to false. I'll double click on that to make it true. And notice that even for changes that I make within the Properties window, that stays in sync with the T-SQL pane right here. And I'll leave the increment and seed values to the default 1. Okay. You can use the context pane of the table designer to create table-level objects, such as constraints. One constraint that would make sense in this dog's table is that a dog's birth date should be before today's date. There might be situations where you might want to enter a dog still in the womb, but not in this application. So to implement this rule, I want to right-click on Check Constraints and add a new check constraint. And that creates a new constraint with the default name of CKDogs column. I want to change this to CKDogs birth date because that's the column that it affects. And press Enter in order to save that change. Notice that I have a constraint with index 0, and it's added it to the create table statement here. It needs to have a check constraint as part of valid code, so it puts in this 1 = 1 check. So I now need to change that and specify the birth date is less than the value returned by getDate. In other words, today's date when this code executes.